All right, let's dive into a question that, on the surface, seems almost impossible. How can the clean, perfect, abstract world of mathematics tell us anything meaningful about the brain? This living, messy, incredibly complicated thing in our heads.
You know, in neuroscience, you can describe what you see for a long, long time. You can list all the parts, map all the connections, but eventually you hit a wall. Because describing isn't enough. The really hard part, the uncomfortable question, is how do we actually explain what the brain is doing? How do we move from just looking at it to truly understanding it? And this is where it gets tricky. On one hand, you have the brain. It's wet, it's noisy, it's biological, it's constantly adapting. And on the other hand, you have math. It's abstract, clean, logical. They feel like they're from two different universes. So how on earth do you build a bridge between them?
That feeling of discomfort is totally understandable. It almost feels wrong, doesn't it? To try and capture something so alive with a bunch of cold equations. And that's really the core issue we need to unpack. Okay, so let's get this right out on the table. A mathematical model can't capture the entire brain. It just can't, not even close. But here's the twist. That isn't a bug, it's a feature. In fact, that's the entire point. To really get this, we have to shift our perspective on what a scientific model is even for. The goal is not to build a perfect one-to-one replica of the brain. The goal is to ask a question in a new way. So, here's the key takeaway. A model is not a statement that the brain is an equation, not at all. A better way to think about it is that a model is a tool. It's like a special lens that allows you to ask one very, very precise question while deliberately blurring everything else out. And this is a perfect analogy. Think about a flock of birds. You could choose to study one single bird, right? You could describe its color, the shape of its wings, its exact position in the sky. That's one level of analysis. Or you could zoom way out and describe the flock as a whole, the beautiful swirling patterns it makes, the overall shape, the way it flows like a single organism. Neither view is more correct than the other. They're just different tools for asking different questions. And that's exactly how brain models work. So let's look at how this plays out in the real world. How do scientists actually use this idea to go from a tiny little component all the way up to a huge functioning system? Well, you start small. The first step is to model a single neuron, but you only focus on its most basic job. How does it turn inputs into outputs? Then, once you have that simple building block, you start connecting them together into a network. And that's when things get really interesting. Suddenly, you start to see these collective dynamics, patterns, rhythms, behaviors that you would never, ever see by looking at just one neuron by itself. This is why some of the simplest neuron models are still incredibly useful today. They're not outdated at all. They're what we call efficient extractions. They're the perfect tool if your question is super focused, like, how does the timing of an input signal change how this one neuron fires? And you don't want to get lost in all the other biological details. And this leads to one of the most amazing insights from this whole field. You don't always need complex rules to generate complex behavior. In fact, these models show us again and again that very simple rules playing out over and over across a network can produce incredibly rich, complex activity that looks a whole lot like the real brain. Okay, so we've seen how modeling works. Now let's talk about why it's such a game changer for science. What does putting things into equations actually give us? I love this idea. Equations force honesty. See, when you describe a theory in words, it's easy to be a little fuzzy, to gloss over the details. But when you have to translate that idea into math, every single assumption you're making is laid bare for everyone to see. There's just nowhere to hide. And that honesty is a superpower. It means we can test ideas in a simulation before spending tons of time and money on a real-world experiment. We can push the system to extremes you could never do in a living animal. And, most importantly, we can make very specific predictions that can be proven wrong. And that, the ability to be falsified, is the absolute bedrock of science. Which brings us to a really deep point. A good model isn't the one that's perfect right out of the box. Sometimes the best model is the one that fails, but fails in a really interesting way. Because the exact point where the model breaks down and doesn't match reality, that's a huge clue. That's a signpost pointing you directly toward the new biology you need to figure out. So all of this means we have to be really clear about what we're doing. It's about understanding the trade-offs. We have to remember that a model is a tool for looking at the brain, not a mirror that perfectly reflects it. And this table sums up that trade-off perfectly. What do we leave out when we build a model? A ton of stuff. Biological detail, the natural messiness of the system, the whole picture. But look at what we get in return. We get clarity, we get predictions we can actually test. And we get the ability to pull one single mechanism out of the soup and study it in isolation. It's a very deliberate choice. And this is maybe the most important rule of all. The danger is not that we simplify. We have to simplify. The real danger is when we forget that we simplified. We have to always remember that we're looking through a specific lens that we designed, not at the thing itself. When you put all this together, modeling becomes more than just a technique. It really becomes a whole new way of thinking, a new way of asking questions about the brain. This way of thinking forces you to ask much sharper questions. Questions like, okay, for this specific problem, what are the most important parts and what's just background noise? Are we even looking at this at the right scale? Should we be at the neuron, the network, or the whole brain? And my favorite, what experiment could I design that would prove my entire explanation wrong? Ultimately, it boils down to a very simple standard. The question isn't, is the model perfect or does it include everything? The only question that matters is, does it help us think more clearly about the brain? If it generates a new insight, it's a success. Which leads us to this really powerful final thought. When we use mathematics to study the brain, we aren't reducing it. We're not making it smaller or less amazing. We are revealing it. We're shining a light on its hidden principles in a way that just wasn't possible before. Now, this process of revelation is always done carefully, it's always partial, and it always requires a lot of humility, remembering what we've left out. But it's how we make progress, and it leaves us with this incredibly exciting question. What will we ask the brain to reveal to us next?